Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome His Excellency Simon Smith, British Ambassador to Ukraine, for a briefing.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good to be back here. Good to see some of you again. Good to see some of you for the first time. It won't surprise you to hear that a lot of my time as British Ambassador to Ukraine in the last few days has been very much tied up with the aftermath of the appalling MH17 disaster. It's an incident that has brought a lot of British experts to Kiev. It's brought British experts in disaster victim identification also to Kharkiv. I was in Kharkiv a few days ago, obviously to do whatever I could to help the international effort to make sure that that first phase in getting the bodies of the victims of MH17 back home, obviously in the first stage to the Netherlands for where the detailed work of disaster victim identification could start. And that was something which we in the British government and in the British Embassy here felt was very important. First of all, to do what we can to help what is a very significant international effort in response to the MH17 disaster, but also as a mark of respect to the British nationals who died in the disaster, 10 of those, and to make sure that everything possible was being done to bear in mind that for each of those victims, well, whatever nationality they are, for each of those victims, there are grieving friends and families. For each of those victims, there are lives that have been lost and futures that have been stolen. The response to MH17 goes on. We have been, from the perspective of the British government, we have been glad to work alongside some really earnest and focused efforts by the Ukrainian authorities to do what they could to ensure that the response was as swift and effective as possible. In that context, we were obviously extremely disturbed and disappointed that access to the crash site was and still is significantly impeded. We saw during the first few days after the air disaster, we saw real difficulties for experts getting access to the site. We saw that they were only able to get there in very small numbers, much smaller numbers than would be characteristic, than would be normal in a normal situation. And we saw that they were only able to get there for limited time and only able to see a limited amount of the site. Now, as you will know, fairly early on in the response to the disaster, there was a United Nations Security Council resolution which called very clearly for full and unfettered access to the site. We very much supported that, and we will continue our efforts in support of ensuring that as soon as possible there is full and free access to the site. There are a lot of priorities still to be worked on there. There is, I think we are pretty sure, still work to go on in locating and identifying further bodies of victims. There's important work to go on in looking and finding further evidence of the accident. Evidence of the crash on the site. And there is clearly ongoing work to do in continuing down the evidence trail to establish the culpability and those who are responsible for carrying out this appalling act. And on that basis, I should say that it's the conviction of the British government that the weight of evidence continues to grow, and it continues to point very significantly in the direction that this disaster was caused by the launch of a surface-to-air missile, and that the missile was launched from an area under the control of militant separatists. What we have been doing in terms of following up the question of what now needs to happen after the air disaster It's very clear to us, and it's very clear to the British government, clear to Prime Minister Cameron, as he made clear in a statement to the House of Commons not so many days ago, that this is a disaster, that this is an act of violence that has happened very much in the context of Russia's continuing efforts to destabilize Ukraine. And that brings me on to further action taken on that front, to talk a little bit about the situation in the European Union. Again, as you will know, the European Union foreign ministers met again on Tuesday this week. They agreed that more work would be set in train to emit further decisions on sanctions on Russia, and that these would go further than the measures agreed at the European Council on July the 16th. And the European Commission presented to member states a concrete proposal for economic measures which would be taken in the absence of full and immediate progress on the issues which the European Council had highlighted. And it's very much the British government's conviction that we are still not seeing from Russia what we have very clearly and simply asked for, which is that Russia should make constructive, positive efforts to de-escalate the situation, and that it should stop its efforts to destabilize Ukraine. What we have seen in recent days is not only this appalling act of violence in bringing down MH17, but we have seen evidence that the flow of weapons and equipment across the border into Ukraine from Russia continues. We see no evidence that Russia is heeding the messages that are emitted from the European Council or from the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union. And in that light, the British government is determined to work within the European Union to push for the fullest possible implementation of the measures agreed by the European Council and updated by the Foreign Affairs Council on Tuesday this week. And in that context, we are participating obviously very fully in the follow-up work to the agreements reached by foreign ministers on Tuesday, and pressing very hard that in the continuing absence of evidence that there is de-escalation from Russia's part, and in the continuing absence of evidence that the efforts to destabilize Ukraine have stopped, we will continue to push for further measures that demonstrate to Russia that there is a cost for still failing to join the international community in an effort to de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine and to stop destabilizing Ukraine, to stop its efforts to destabilize a sovereign, independent country. That, I think, is where I will leave my introductory remarks, and I hope that this time I will leave sufficient time for you to ask questions. So the floor is over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Peter Leonard, Associated.
Leonard, Associated Press. Отже, ви сказали, що докази вказують свою громаду на те, що це було збито ракетою земля-повітря із ділянки, що контролювалися бунтівниками. І дедалі більше таких доказів. Чи не могли би ви сказати, які ви маєте останні докази, найсвіжіші докази? І що ви здобули одразу після падіння літака? І далі, яких зусиль докладає Міністерство закордонних справ для того, щоб тиснути на Росію? Перше питання.
Great specifics on, what piece of evidence has fallen into place on what day. I will just say that the evidence of various kinds, and these evidence of movements of relevant weapon systems in the given area in Ukraine, evidence derived from photographs of the crash site, evidence of communications. Again, much of this will be known to all of you through what has been out there in the public eye. But I will just say that this picture is something that continues to accumulate. I'm not going to go into detail about what specific pieces of evidence arose yesterday or the day before, but the picture continues to accumulate. I would expect it will continue to do so as well. There are obviously there has been a limited amount of access to the crash site. There is a degree of increasing photographic evidence that is being made available to use by those experts, those people who are expert in analysing post-air disaster evidence. And as I say, that picture in various ways continues to grow. As far as Graham Phillips is concerned, it's not our practice to comment in detail on consular issues. There is a principle of consular confidentiality that we observe, but I can say that we are in very close touch with the Ukrainian authorities on the case of Graham Phillips, and that we are in touch with his family, and that we are providing all consular assistance that we can.
Okay. The next question is going to be in Russian from international sector of Maidan.
Центральная рада сотен Майдан.
Central Council of the Companies of Maidan. After the downed Boeing, terrorists downed 2 military aircrafts, Su-25. So there's no big fuss about this. There's no condemnation of Russia on that matter. So when the Western communities will undertake specific measures?
There that I felt I'd already answered in my introductory remarks, because I made very clear that in the mind of our Prime Minister, all these incidents, I mean, he made clear that the MH17 incident had happened within a broader context of Russian aggression against Ukraine, within a broader context of Russian efforts to destabilize Ukraine. So I think it is very much recognized that we are not coming from a position where we think that where we think that the only act of violence and the only thing that matters in the last week was the downing of MH17. We're very clear that this has happened in the context of an ongoing effort to destabilize Ukraine. We're clear that it's happened in the context of an ongoing conflict that we want to see de-escalated. And again, because of that, that is the context in which, as I've said, the British government will make every effort to make sure that the European Union response to this in terms of relentlessly pushing on down the sanctions track. We want to make sure that response is robust and it's clear and it's progressive. And when I say progressive, I mean that when the European Council first looked at these issues in early March this year, and when they first set out these two very, very simple but very important criteria of what it is they wanted to see de-escalation and to see a halt to destabilization, they were very clear that that was a very clear and direct call on Russia to accept responsibility and to engage constructively. What has happened in previous weeks, in the weeks since the early March European Council meeting, is that we've seen very little evidence of de-escalation, and we've still seen very little evidence that Russia has taken action to stop its destabilization efforts. And for that reason, the logic is that the sanctions dynamic continues, that and as I mentioned, this is a progressive dynamic. It's action that will continue. Each time the European leaders have come together, there have been further decisions on sanctions, and where we are now, obviously, is that the work looking at scoping out and defining what will be the measures in the context of the so-called Tier 3 package of sanctions imposed on a sectoral basis, that work is also now underway. So I expect that dynamic very much to continue, and as I say, the British government will, in the absence of real, genuine, responsible efforts to de-escalate and stop destabilizing, the British government will push for that sanctions dynamic to roll relentlessly on.
If I may just to ask clarifying questions, and thank you so much for being so detailed about it, but the general feeling is that even though we've heard really firm words and firm actions on behalf of, a number of political leaders in Europe over the past week, at the same time, there is a feeling there is a lot of pinpointing going on. France, in layman's words, says to the United Kingdom, well, before we stop selling Mistral ships to Russia, you guys should really take away those licenses which allow British business to sell military equipment to the Russia. And then somebody else says, well, and Germany probably should stop training the military personnel in Russia, which they have done extensively in the past couple of years. So to what extent your experience tells you that this pointing of the blame will delay actually imposing the sectoral sanctions, which are it seems like at this point a critical moment, because not only Ukraine has suffered so much, but the international community already has suffered a terrible, terrible loss.
Well, just to make one point from the start in response to your question, the British government made a further fundamental change to its policy on exports of military equipment to Russia in March this year, and we do not export arms to Russia. We are and will continue to be very firm on a policy of not supplying military equipment to Russia. Clearly, I'm aware of allegations in the press in recent days that position, or that those restrictions are being got round. We're looking obviously very seriously into that, but it is absolutely our position that there are no exports of arms to Russia from Britain. In terms of, I think you ask a very fair question in terms of the risk that time is lost and that the strength of the European response on these issues is diluted if efforts are diverted into some discussion that says, no, you go first, we're waiting for you to act before we act, and that sort of thing. Which is why I think for the British government, we are very keen for there to be as comprehensive as possible a moving forward on the decisions that the European Council and the Foreign Affairs Committee has taken. So that's why I stress that we want to see the fullest implementation possible of the decisions taken by the European Council and Foreign Affairs Committee, and that means that we move forward across the board. We rather agree that we can't afford to lose time in saying, well, we'll have a bit of this and a bit of that. The clear logic of this policy is that we need to, as I say, progressively to strengthen a position in which we are demonstrating that there are real and actual and serious economic costs to Russia for the choice that it's taken to continue destabilizing Ukraine, and for the choice that it's taken to avoid its responsibilities to contribute constructively in de-escalation. So we want a comprehensive move forward right across the board of the measures agreed by European heads of government, and we all are conscious that there can be costs to us, there can be economic costs to us, quite serious ones, of moving down this track. But I think in the minds of the British government, we're very clear. We've looked at that. Of course we know there'll be costs to us, but we look ahead and we look and think about the costs to us of not taking effective action in the situation in which we're in, and our judgment is that those costs could be a good deal greater. So our conviction is that we need to move forward quickly, and we need to move forward comprehensively.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, do we have any questions, any more questions for the ambassador? Yes, please.
Just if I may, my question to you as a super experienced diplomat. Mr. Ambassador, what do you think, when enough is enough? When Putin can actually stop or can be stopped in his efforts to reconstruct the Russian empire?
Well, you were kind enough to preface that question by asking me as an experienced diplomat. I'm not sure how useful my experience has been, but I will say that this is not the first time that I've been involved in issues where we have had to develop and take forward a policy which is basically saying there is a choice to be made here, and whether it's a message to Iran, whether it's a message to to North Korea, which are two other contexts in which I've been active in my diplomatic career, or whether it's a message to Russia. It's a message that says there's a choice to be made here, and the choice is that there is a cooperative path to take, and there is a non-cooperative, in a sense, non-cooperative, disruptive, destructive path to take. And that if the choice is to take the destructive path, then it's very difficult to say. It's difficult to say, in answer to your question, when will all this stop? But I think the logic of this policy that says, if you choose the disruptive, destructive path, then, and you continue down that path, then our path will continue too. Our strategy of demonstrating that that's a wrong decision and that there are costs for taking that wrong decision, that our strategy will also continue.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Vitaly Senko, Ukraine News Agency. If you let me, please, I would like to change the subject. Can you update information about the work that were going on about recovery funds, stolen funds from former Ukrainian officials? You remember it was created special team for this kind of investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question, and I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to answer it in fantastic detail, not least because a lot of the work on these issues has to go on with a great deal of discretion. It's not an area where it makes a lot of sense when you're actually on the trail of stolen assets. It's not a great idea to be telling the world whose trail you are on, which assets you're looking for. So I'm not going to stand here and give the game away and give a tip off to anyone whose assets we're after. You'll remember that at the end of April, there was an international conference in London, which I think was very useful in focusing people's minds, not only on the very large range of practical actions that need to be taken in pursuit of a successful strategy of asset recovery, but also I think to concentrate people's minds on the fact that it can be a slow, laborious, it needs to be obviously a very thorough process, and it's a very painstaking process. And in that sense, it may still be some time before we're able to point to sort of major results of this process. But from what I'm hearing about it, and I can even tell you that for the reasons I've just stated, quite a lot of this process I'm not in the picture in either, and I think there are very good reasons for that. I think these are issues on which the principle that if you don't need to know about it, you shouldn't know about it, I think that's a very valuable principle when you're involved in asset recovery. So there's a lot of this stuff that I don't know about either. But what I am assured of is that the very good cooperation between British and Ukrainian institutions that we gave a good boost to with that international conference in April, that very much continues. I know, because I've seen our experts come and go in Ukraine, I know that the process of their practical and professional interaction with Ukrainian institutions continues. So this is very much, I think I can reassure you, although, as I say, I can't give you much detail on this, I think I can reassure you that there is a lot of very practical professional focus on this strand of work. It continues, and it continues very much with the objective in mind that we want it to be a results-oriented process, and we want to produce the results in terms of identifying assets and obviously identifying ways in which they can be returned to Ukraine.
Thank you. There is one more question here, please.
Славный Евгений, стадун.
Are you not afraid that economic pressure on Russia will provoke it to global military conflict? Because before I thought that those delays were made not to provoke Russia to conflict. But you don't speak about military assistance on territories which are not under the control of terrorists. How are you going to act, the UK and also EU? Я думаю,
we are laying out a choice here for Russia, and there is enough experience in Russia of the benefits of cultivating and developing cooperative relationships with the international community. I know from having worked for 4 years in Russia that there are And I know from what we're seeing in the response to the sanctions measures that have been taken already, I know that there is a receptivity to what is going on. I know that there is already pain being felt in economic terms in Russia, and so I think on both sides of the equation, if you like, the fact that I think we are confident that the benefits of cooperation are widely understood in Russia, and we're confident that the costs of non-cooperation are also widely understood. We are, I think, persuaded of the logic of continuing down the path of sanctions, and the fact that we have seen that as yet, regrettably, the measures we have taken have not yet elicited the response from Russia that we had that we had wished to see. Our conclusion from that is that we need to continue. We need to continue to demonstrate not only is there a present cost for non-cooperation, but that this cost will, it can and it will increase. We've seen, and just to come back to looking at the evidence of what the economic effect of sanctions has been so far. I think many of you will be as familiar, if not more than I will be, on the extent to which the illegally annexed territory of Crimea is not exactly an economic success story. And I think that, again, it is very clear from the messages emanating from the business community in Russia that nobody is claiming that the sanctions already taken by the European Union have had no effect, and that they have not been the subject of anxiety and fears about what might happen next. And so I think it's very important in this context that the signal continues to be to say, well, look, you've seen a certain range of sanctions measures so far, and this will continue. It will get worse. There is a lot more we can do, and in some respects, I would reply to some of the understandable expressions of concern that say, actually, the European Union has not gone far enough and it's not gone fast enough. I would say, well, there is an argument for saying, well, you carry on progressively, steadily churning out one decision after another, and the message is, if there is no constructive response, then there'll be more measures. So instead of sort of firing instead of implementing all the policies available to you all in one go, you can say, look, this is a progressive policy. It's one that will get more and more damaging to Russia's economic interests in the absence of responses from Russia. And I think you can conclude, to come back to your question, I think you can conclude from the fact that this policy continues, that in the minds of European leaders, this is a wiser policy than one which somehow sits there and fears that if we take one action, there might be an unpredictable response from Russia. As I say, I think that we need to set our policies in the context of the expectations that lie on Russia as a responsible member of the international community, to measure up to those expectations, to say, our judgment is that in its strategy of destabilizing Ukraine, Russia has not acted responsibly. There is an opportunity there to make the choice to engage in de-escalation, to engage more constructively, and if that happens, then we have a scenario of cooperation. We have a scenario of pursuing in harmony the very many long-range economic objectives that we share together, but in the absence of those responses from Russia, the policy of sanctions, the policy of demonstrating the costs of non-cooperation will continue.
Thank you very much. We also sincerely hope that the time the international community gives Russia to improve its responsible behavior does not lead to any more losses of life, neither in Ukraine nor internationally. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us. Thank you very much for finding the time. Thanks.